Welcome to Carly Tackles, making your own office desk. This desk is a standing, sitting desk that I built to my custom dimensions. We're going to take this design and make it come to life. I'm releasing a few videos on this office desk series. The first one is just an overview, more for entertainment, of how the whole thing came to be. The rest are going to be a deeper dive into the step-by-step processes. I start by gluing up all of our boards. I'm using poplar, which is a less expensive board. Feel free to use any higher quality material. Then once this glue is dried, I cut it down to my dimensions. These are 8-foot boards that I'm cutting down to 80 inches in length. But this is a custom top, so you can build it to whatever dimensions you would like. I use a Bora edge glide to kind of help my circular saw cut these straight lines. And I also cut a bit off the other side too. Next, we're going to focus on the internal cut. I need to cut a 2-inch rectangle out of the desk to separate the desk into 2 pieces. This 2-inch gap will be later filled with epoxy to bring it back together. To help me cut this 2-inch gap, I'm using the Craig Rip Guide along with my circular saw. Once you have the internal and outer pieces separated, we're going to mostly focus on the internal piece for a while. What I have here is a Rockler's sign kit. You can get it in different fonts and sizes. I have 3 words that I want to cut out fully on this desk. Right now I'm focusing on lining those up and then using a router and a special bit and brass collar. It will help you stay in the stencils. Now I have to make multiple passes. I can't cut through all in one, so I'm going to repeat this 3 to 4 times, adjusting the bit to different depths until the point where I actually cut out. When I do that, I do place a sacrificial board underneath to help me prevent some tear out. The next thing I have is these Golden Girl coasters that I would like to inlay in the desk. I made my own template for the coasters, and now using the same brass fitting and router bit, I am cutting out where that coaster would be. And I sanded it a little bit for a smoother finish, and I give it a little test to make sure the coaster is a good fit. I did have to re-router and re-sand on one of them, so doing a dry fit is a good idea. I have 2 of these, 1 on each side. Lastly, on the outer piece, I'm using a round over bit in the trim router, and I'm going to round over just the outer edge, but on both sides, so it's a full round over. This will become important for our epoxy to allow it to roll over the sides. Before we can start mixing up some fun epoxy, we need to make a form to hold our desk and allow the epoxy to pour in between the 2 pieces and prevent the epoxy from running out on the floor. We also need to use material that will allow the epoxy to separate from the form so we can return it back to the desk. The material I'm using is melamine. I cut out the bottom and now I'm cutting strips for the sides. To really ensure the epoxy doesn't stick to this form, we're going to be using Tyvek tape. You want to lay your Tyvek tape over the form before you put the sides so you can get every part covered. Also, as you're doing the strips, you want to overlap your previous strip slightly. And you also want to do your side pieces before and after you install them. For more details on this step, check out step 2's video, pouring the epoxy. To attach the sides, I pre-drilled pocket holes and am driving the screws in now. I'm fitting the form to the desk, not measurements, not right angles, but fitting it to the desk. Once you have your ends and sides ready to go, you can move it to where you want to pour the epoxy. I recommend somewhere where you can control your temperature and also low dust. You really want to make sure your area is level before pouring any epoxy. In today's epoxy build, we are going to be doing a quick coat, a casting epoxy, which is good up to 1 inch, And then the last piece is the epoxy kit that we'll be using for a seal coat and a flood coat. First is our quick coat epoxy. This is the same as a seal coat epoxy, only that it cures faster, so it doesn't take as long to wait before you're ready to pour the casting. And that's why we're using it now. Each epoxy brand may have a different ratio and recommendation for stirring, so I highly suggest that you read the directions first. This is a 1-to-1 ratio, and I think you normally have to stir for a few minutes. I already did the outside piece by now, but I'll show you how I did the internal. One of the things I did to kind of lock this internal piece down, kind of like gluing it, is I placed some of that quick coat down, using spacer blocks to help me make sure my internal piece is perfectly centered in the outer. Once I feel I have a good position, I'm going to press down to try to lock in that piece. Now, I did not have any trouble with this moving on me as I did the rest of the seal coats or even the casting pour, so this definitely did the trick. With the raw wood, you want to make sure that you're sealing the pores so air does not escape and ruin your casting, and I'll show you that in a second. Firstly, I'm doing a little bit of a layer for that reason, as well as a glue. I'm going to inlay my coasters. A lot of people do this with pennies, buttons, whatever it is that you like, you can preserve inside of an epoxy pour. So I'm using this quick coat to get the base, and then I'll put a little bit over the top to seal it in. Once that is all said and done, I'll pour the remaining quick coat over the top. I do recommend you use a shower squeegee. It works really well, and to do that first before your edges. It's a little messy if you do it the other way around, and if you watch step 2's video pouring the epoxy, you'll see that I flipped that and I made a mess. So this way, much better. Using a squeegee, just are lightly pulling and applying pressure to spread it out. You get used to it. At first you're a little unsure how much pressure to apply, but as you see it, you'll see what moves the epoxy around. It was easy to adjust. This is my first time doing this. Then I want to make sure all of the edges are sealed. We are going to pour the casting epoxy in between the layers, and I don't want any air bubbles. The other thing is all of those letters. I did try a brush. It did not work as well as my finger. With my finger, I could feel the drier spots, I could feel the grooves, and I could really make sure I'm getting this coated. After you have everything covered with a nice thin layer, it's time to apply heat. I'm using a benzomatic propane torch. You can also use a heat gun. Key here, keep the heat moving, don't hold it, and don't light it on fire. It should look something like this. That heat releases the bubbles, you have your smooth layer, kind of a glossier surface, and you are going to let it cure for whatever time is on the box. When you are satisfied that it is cured, we need to lightly sand where we are going to pour the epoxy. We need to make sure we have a mechanical bond. We don't want this to separate from the seal coat and the pouring epoxies. I have watched some other videos like with river tables. They say they put on the seal coat and then the epoxy, and then they separate. So I was really worried about that, so I made sure I did some sanding to help it. Next is our casting epoxy. For StoneCoat Countertops, which I talk a little bit more about in part 2, this is a 2-to-1 ratio. Ignore the A and B, flip it for me if you wouldn't mind. I meant to write A and then B being the smaller portion. A is the bigger tub, clearly, and then B is actually the hardener. And they do recommend that you pour the A in first and then the B. It actually helps it stir it up because the hardener is heavier, more dense, and it wants to sink. One of the things they really recommended when you're doing the casting to avoid the bubbles is to hand stir, not with a paddle or a power drill. For this casting, we will do that on our flood coat, but for the casting, to stir it up with a paint stick worked great. You want to alternate your hands. It does take a little bit out of it. I think it was for 6 to 8 minutes. Next is the fun part. You can pick different powders, colors, glitter additives, and add it to your epoxy. I'm adding diamond dust, blue pearl, which really helps the opaqueness that I'm looking for, and a little extra glitter to help sparkle in my light. Once you kind of get it mixed up, I poured it into a smaller cup so I could see how thick and how opaque it would be. And when I liked it, I was ready to pour it. You can do these in batches. So if you want to lay down a lighter transparency or a different color and you're not sure how dark you want it, you can lay it down and assess where you are, and always add more blue pearl to another mixture that you'll pour on top and then mix it together. If you're doing little detailed areas like I am here, I do recommend pouring in a little cup. It's easier to control than that big bucket. And if I do happen to spill, which I did here and there, I just had a paper towel with me that I was able to wipe it off. Because that quick coat did have time to cure, I was able to wipe off some of those drippings. After you get a good layer of epoxy down, we're going to want to apply some heat to help release bubbles and to make sure we have good movement. And then feel free to add more. So this one's a little bit more blue pearl. One to make sure you weren't going to be able to see my lights underneath. And your letters, you may notice, or in spots, you may notice that, hey, I poured up to this line and a few minutes later it lowered. It's probably because it's running underneath. As it cures, it will stop doing that. That would be one of the reasons we seal the bottom really well with Tyvek tape, is because we knew it would go underneath. Once you feel you got it where you want, again, apply some more heat. You can do some fun swirls in the epoxy. Step 2, pouring the epoxy, shows you more in depth what I did, what I used to mix, and more details about the product. So definitely check that out. I'll be releasing each one of these steps 1 week after this one. Once it's cured, you can remove your forms. It's one of the reasons to use pocket holes. We could easily remove and access the screws. And then we just ripped out the sides and very carefully, with the help of some putty knives, loosen the desk from the bottom. Here you can see the bleed through of the epoxy that went under the letters and around it, but notice it did release pretty well from the Tyvek. I wanted to test to see how well I did at mixing the powders. You shouldn't be able to see my hand, but when light shines from the bottom, that light should be able to shine through the epoxy. Now we're ready for the next step, which is a lot of sanding. For the bottom with the runoff, I tried using an orbital sander, wasn't powerful enough, had to switch to a belt sander to really get it flat again. For the top though, I'm using an orbital sander, starting off with 80 grit, and we're just doing a light sanding here. After each grit of sandpaper, you are going to do a bunch of repetition of steps here. You're going to sand, wipe, preferably with rags to get the dust. Also, I vacuumed with a brush in between as well to get most of it. Then after the wiping, I got a little acetone, applied that to the rag, and did more wiping just to make sure I was getting all the epoxy dust off before going to the next grit of sandpaper. You're going to go through 80, 120, and 220 before we're ready to attempt our seal coat, which is the next thing. This is similar to a quick coat, only it takes a longer time to cure. This is a 1-to-1 ratio with this product. And for our seal coats, we're going to do 3 applications of this. Our seal coats are only 1 ounce. You're going to spread this out over your desk, and using one of those shower squeegees, you're going to spread it around. Now you're going to do 3 applications of this. So one night you're going to put it on, you're going to let it cure. The next night you're going to do a lot of sanding and then apply another layer of seal coat that same night, let it cure. The reason you're doing this and why it's so much work is every seal coat you do is going to make your flood coat that much better. Every bubble, scratch, areas where it's a little sunken in or not level, you're going to be able to fix with these applications of seal coats. That will make your flood coat better. Also notice that I was rubbing my hand along the edges, which will help reduce surface tension and allow the epoxy to roll over the edge, which is what we need to happen. Let's take a closer look at that sanding and application schedule. You're going to apply your first ounce of seal coat. You're going to sand at 80 grit, vacuum with the brush, wipe to remove that epoxy dust, wipe with acetone, move on to the next grit. Do all that again, move on to the next grit. You're going to apply that second coat of seal coat that same night you sand and let it sit a day, let it cure, and then you're going to repeat. You're going to do 3 applications of the seal coat and 3 sanding sessions to get it ready for your flood coat, which is our last application and is 3 ounces instead of 1. This one I would suggest really pouring in the middle. Instead of using a squeegee, we're going to use a 1/8 inch trowel. It's recommended by StoneCoat Countertops and available in their toolkits. I have links for it in the description below. And this is how you're going to spread it. It takes a little getting used to compared to the squeegee, so that's why I recommended you stay mostly in the middle until you get a feel for how much pressure, how much to move it. Once you get a feel of using the trowel, you're going to work your way over to the edges, and yes, you are going to have it run off too. But remember, we want a thicker coat here. Our seal coats were 1 ounce. This is supposed to be 3 ounces. Once you're done with the trowel, we're going to move on to the chop brush. Also one of the tools available in their kit. And we are going just to give, with lack of a better word, little chops. You're lightly pushing the brush downward to spread the bristles, and you are breaking surface tension. You're going to do this to the top and the sides, especially the edges. As you can see, your epoxy isn't running uniformly over the edge, it's doing drips, and when you take your brush to it, you will be able to get it all to run smoothly over the side. And lastly, we're going to apply some heat. Make sure we're not having any air bubbles, everything is smooth, and it'll look like glass. Here is a closer look. You'll see you have some run over, which is absolutely fine. We'll take care of that. And look how smooth that is. I do recommend propping your board up, like with bench cookies, which is what I have, or boards, to allow that drip to roll over the edges. Then let it cure for a few days before moving on to this part, which is getting ready for lights. I'm using GOV's Wi-Fi lights. I made sure this was super long to cover my desk. They separated out into 2 strips, and I wasn't sure how everything was going to lay out, so I did some practice runs with the help of some paint tape. I figured out how to do my corners, how I wanted it laid out, internally with the letters and externally with that 2-inch rectangle border. It turned out that I did have some extra, and I will put it along the top to shine on the wall. Here I'm just tracing with a pencil an idea of where the lights are. I will go back through later with a framing square and try to straighten up those edges and make it a little bit easier to cut out these grooves. But here's a closer look. Notice that my corners, they're not sharp turns. I had to do some loops, had to kind of get creative to make sure I got the lights to cover where I needed. I do recommend a practice run first. Once you're good and you feel you got it, you can remove the paint tape, remove the lights, because now you have that pencil. You can retrace your lines, fix anything you didn't like, and then you can route your groove. I'm using my Ryobi trim router with the help of a drywall T-square to keep me straight when I need to, and a vacuum. For the router bit, you can use a straight cut router bit or anything that would cut a wide enough groove to fit your lights. Once your grooves are all cut, it's time to install your lights. For this, I am using duct tape. I wanted to use duct tape because I wanted the ability to remove the lights if something went wrong, or if I decided I need to adjust them. The key was to keep the sticky part of the duct tape off the lights. So I did some strips where I folded it onto itself and added like a little cushion between the real tape. It actually turned out really well and it held together. I did need to go back and adjust the lights in the words. It's too close to the wood and wouldn't shine through all the way. So I was very thankful that I used duct tape and was able to adjust. Take a note of that strip along the top. That's a little extra lights that will reflect off the wall. These lights also have a microphone so you can set it to change colors with music. For the desk frame, I'm using an autonomous frame that you can put any top you want on it. If you're interested in how to assemble the frame and attach the desk, make sure you check out step 3 of my video and I'll walk you through the unboxing and assembly of the frame. This is a very nice sturdy frame. I was really impressed with it, and I do have a few of their other products, and no, they are not a sponsor. Here's a quick look of how the standing sitting works. There is an up and down where you can adjust your height. There's also an M and numbers so you can set memory. Here is a closer look at the desk. You can notice the words glow better in certain areas than others. My believe is pretty good up until that last E. Achieve looks pretty good, but take a look at dream. See that D and that R? I wasn't able to sag the lights in that spot because of the frame. So that one didn't do so hot, but having that duct tape did allow me to let the lights sag a little bit in the other spots and worked out really well for that. Also would really recommend getting their cable tray. It's standard cable tray, works on any of their desks. Very nice for cable management. The power adapter for your desk just mounts right to your desk. And there you go. That's your underneath side. Now taking a look back at how we began with the simple design drawing out on paper, I think it turned out really good. I did have one extra step left to do with this desk, and that is to drill the holes for the electrical. I waited 30 days to make sure the epoxy was good and hard before setting it up with my computers and keyboards.